Welcome to our fifth and final Mining Issues in a Changing World webinar series. I'm Michael Bourassa, a member of the Global Mining Group here at Fasken. Happy Canada Day to our Canadian audience and happy 4th of July to our US audience. A little bit about Fasken. We are a team of over 750 lawyers with 10 offices across Canada, South Africa, the United Kingdom, and China. And we provide expertise in 40 different practice areas. We're proud to be named the official partner with the Canadian Olympic Committee and Team Canada. And as you can see by the slide, we've been recognized for our expertise in a number of different areas. We've had 4 webinar series this month, and this is our final one. So far, we've done one on Canadian mining issues, on mining finance, on international mining investment issues, critical minerals, and today on ESG. And video recordings are available for all of the sessions that we've done so far. And our moderator for today's session will be Tanneke Heersche. She's a partner in our Toronto office and a member of the Global Mining Group. Her practice focuses on project development in emerging markets. She is highly ranked in Chambers Global and other legal directories for her expertise in the development of extractive sector projects in Africa. So welcome, over to you, Tanneke.
Great, thanks very much, Michael. And I'd like to add my welcome to everybody joining us today for this 5th and last of our seminar series. Just 2 very small housekeeping matters. For those of you that have joined us for some of the other seminars, we're taking a similar format. Each of our panelists will give a short presentation on one of the key ESG aspects that they're focusing on, and we'll follow that with a Q&A session. There's a chat feature at the bottom right of your screen. So for those that would like to feed questions into the Q&A, by all means, send those through, and we will try and address those at the end of the seminar. We've had some interest already and some questions that have come through in advance of the seminar. So we'll look forward to a wide-ranging and good discussion. For those that wouldn't mind sending in their views, there's a short survey at the bottom of your screen. So please let us know whether you enjoyed the seminar or the series generally. So with that, I'll launch into today's subject matter, which is ESG. These are 3 letters that I think we have seen more and more of late, not just during this pandemic period, but also prior to the pandemic period. Mining firms were already facing a growing pressure in relation to a wide variety of ESG issues, whether it was from investors in relation to investment decisions and access to capital, whether it was stakeholder activity, governments, shareholders, again, investors, communities, employees, quite a wide range, and growing civil society and regulatory scrutiny of mining firms' ESG performance. As we'll find out over the course of the seminar, the ESG issues facing the mining industry are wide and varied, and they range across the mine life cycle, right from the very early exploration stage all the way through to product distribution, and in the middle, of course, everything that goes along with the development of the project. I think we've seen, there have been some references to post-COVID-19. I don't think, given where we are globally, we're in the post-COVID-19 phase. A lot of mining firms in Latin America and Africa are still dealing very much with current COVID issues, but let's just say that during this pandemic phase, and with a focus on coming out of it, we've heard the phrase building back better numerous times. And this building back better as it applies to the mining industry has focused on climate change, but with an increasing emphasis now also on social factors and management of operations by mining companies and the resource industry generally. Whether it's human rights and transparency, value-added technologies, the range of topics is immense. So with that range, we've tried to pick some key issues that are facing the mining industry, recognizing that in an hour and a bit, it's quite difficult to cover all aspects. But we've tried to focus on some of the ones that may be most relevant to you. They include governance, policies and procedures, disclosure, both regulatory and best practice, environmental and climate change aspects, access to capital, and the last one you'll see there, implications for the mining industry from the boardroom to the courtroom. Just a short discussion on some of the risks that resource companies face in their operations on the ground. Within the mining industry, and the mining industry within the global context is of course operating in an increased sustainability focus. And it's not just stakeholders in the mining industry that are pushing for ESG and general sustainability factors. Something totally unrelated, for those that may have seen it this morning, Amazon has just launched a climate pledge fund. So the mining industry and ESG is operating in a very wide global context where sustainability factors are highly, highly relevant. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Francois Joubert. He's a corporate lawyer in our Johannesburg office. And Francois has a wide-ranging practice that includes mining, energy, climate change, and corporate social responsibility. Francois is a member of our global mining group, and he's going to give us all there is to know about global trends in ESG policies and practices and some organizational ESG policy and practice tips. Francois?
Thank you, Tanneke. Good evening, everyone. Nice to have you as an audience. Next. I'm the one that starts off by saying, what do we need to know about ESG? Where do we even start with this thing called ESG in a company setup? Do we have the appropriate organizational policies and procedural skills and expertise to manage ESG strategy? Do we understand what sustainability risk means? How are we identifying and addressing key environmental and social risks associated with our business and the impacts they have? How do we address an evolving and developing ESG regulatory landscape? It is a foreign concept, but over the last couple of years, it has gained a lot of traction, and it has certainly become an investor's nightmare to try and see what pickings out there are actually the right ones for us to increase shareholder value. Next. Next, please. So, how do we start? We obviously look at global trends in the ESG policies and practices field, and we see that more and more companies are faced with a very strict regime of how do I operate in a safe environment? How do I exercise my license to operate? One clear indication is that you must show that the company is adhering to all policies and procedures that are aligned with universally accepted ESG guidelines, standards, and of course codes of conduct. And just to let you be reminded that everyone is writing about this, all the investors, asset fund companies, More than 8 in 10 individual investors in the United States now express interest in sustainable investing, with half actually doing so. So the implementation of a globally acceptable ESG policy and procedure clearly showcase that a company's governance ability to perform as a steward of the environment whilst managing its relationship with employees, suppliers, customers, government, and communities is a financially viable and socially, in a financially viable and socially conscionable manner is a very important step in the right direction. In other words, companies must show that they are a preferred and valuable investment target. Next. So, as you know, ESG is made up of 3 key pillars. E for environment, the company must clearly show that it's a steward of the environment, conduct its activities and practices in a responsible manner, have mitigation measures in place. S for social, manage relationships with employees, suppliers, and customers in a responsible manner, and then, be a transparent, open, and accountable company with prudent leadership, sound decision making, and have all the internal boxes ticked as far as internal controls, audits, and protection of shareholder rights are concerned. Next. So in terms of environmental policy consideration, company should develop an early warning strategy to identify social risk factors. In other words, any potential environmental event or condition that poses actual or potential material negative impacts on the value of investments, resulting in an adverse sustainability impact. The ESG Compliance Performance Register is a very good starting point for a company. If you have all your aspects of the company and the associated impacts covered in such a relationship, one has a very good go-to instrument to look at what the company's impact would be on environmental, social, and governance levels. So in other words, ask yourself the question, does the company's working conditions show high regard for its employees' health and safety and the environment? Are other stakeholders' interests taken into account? And not only looking at environmental factors, as we will see next one, social aspects in your policy considerations are equally important. What is the labor and working conditions of my workforce? Do I look at community health and safety and security issues in every project planning? How do I acquire land? How do I access and use land? What about resettlement issues? Indigenous people that have cultural and long-standing rights in the areas. So your register should provide for the inclusion of all socio-economic related aspects that may be a threat or are actually a threat. Next one. As I've then mentioned, the last one is governance. And in your compliance performance register, look at the inclusion of procedures that clearly demonstrate good corporate citizenship through transparent ethical behavior, environmental awareness, and sound corporate decision making, which incorporates ESG principles in your overall corporate strategy, in your risk management strategies, and then be accountable for that, especially on the reporting and disclosure side. Next. So my colleagues will delve a little bit deeper into the ESG tools out there, but as you can see, there's a myriad of go-to instruments that one can use that have been around for some time, or others that have been updated every single year. And you're looking at the broader global framework of the United Nations, especially on the Global Compact, the Principles for Responsible Investing. All of those are aligned to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the Equator Principles, brand new ones came out this year. But then industry specific, you're also looking at, IRMA, Standards for Responsible Mining, International Capital Markets Association, all of those. Next. So what should your strategy and implementation action plan look like? Well, first of all, someone must take accountability. Someone must be in charge of this, the ESG policy in a company and the strategy. Once such a person is identified, identify and designate a mandated board member responsible for managing the ESG portfolio. That person then should ideally constitute a team of people that can contribute to this ESG strategy and policy through their experience. And the board must demonstrate directors and companies' commitment to operating in good faith with due care and diligence. Next. Obviously, then the board should be made aware. Not all board members are accustomed to ESG and its implementation. So there should be a very strong board awareness campaign. Next. ESG committee must then develop a company-specific strategy, policy and procedures that are linked to their business model and their usual reporting standards and monitoring requirements. Next. Then there's a policy. It must be adopted by the board, and it must clearly set out how the company intends to implement, communicate, manage, monitor, and report on company-specific ESG risk performance measures. And it must be communicated across the board to all employees and then implemented on a regular scale. Next. Implementation is very important because you need to identify the relevant industry-specific ESG performance indicators, disclosure and reporting requirements, as my colleagues will discuss. Develop a company-specific procedure that identify the performance and monitoring and reporting methodology that you will be able to comply with. Don't reach for the moon if you're only operating on the ground. Develop procedures in terms of the awareness and training and delegation of functional powers within the company, and then you just get on the road and do it. Next.
I know for all of you that were watching or are watching, there is a lot of material there in Francois' presentation. Certainly, if I were looking at what I then do with all of these compliance processes that I've put in place, how do I translate that internal system to external disclosure? And helping us with that is going to be Janet Howard. Janet is a corporate transactional lawyer in our Toronto office, and her practice includes cross-border M&A and private equity transactions. She's a member of our global mining group as well as the global energy group. And she is going to speak to us about both public disclosure of ESG performance and best practices in ESG disclosure. Janet?
No, thank you very much, Tanneke, and thank you everybody for participating in our seminar. We've been looking forward to this. Next slide, please. I'll be speaking to three things on the topic of ESG disclosure to stakeholders. And when we talk about stakeholders, the people we're focusing on are your investors, your regulators, and the government. So specifically, what are the ESG performance indicators? You'll see there are lots of sources, but what are they and where can they be found? Secondly, how can you avoid pitfalls in preparing your disclosure and in disseminating it? And lastly, what is good ESG disclosure? It doesn't necessarily need to be great, and there are some benefits to just sticking with what's good and what works. Next slide. So as Francois alluded to, there are lots of sources for the ESG performance indicators. There's the Global Reporting Initiative, the GRI. People will be familiar with the acronym SASB, TCFD. The good news here is that there is an effort underway to consolidate these standards, and the World Economic Forum has released a draft consultation paper, January 2020 of this year, in an effort to put all of these requirements in one place, which I think will be very helpful to the exercise. Right now, there's a lot of density, overlap, causes some confusion. When those efforts are undertaken to consolidate, I would urge a cautious approach. There is a benefit to referring to the sector-specific requirements and performance indicators. The overall ESG framework applies to retail, agriculture, food and drug. What performance indicators and what criteria relate more closely to the mining industry and the operations that are conducted? And when you focus your review of this material in that way, there's an opportunity to not just use ESG as a tool to identify and mitigate risks, but also to identify the business opportunities that this regime presents. For example, how are you integrating new technology into your operations to be cost effective? How are you using this as an opportunity to engage in stakeholder groups that you may not have contemplated before? How are you integrating some of these strategies to mitigate potential litigation risk? That's something that Cliff will be speaking to. Next slide. So it's clear, and it's a helpful fact, there is no definitive list for ESG criteria. To give some of this some color, what I can do is offer some commentary that's meant to indicate how this relates to the mining industry specifically. So with respect to the E, consider whether there are opportunities to adapt new technology to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and what's the impact in doing so on climate change. Are you getting off the grid? Are you integrating new technology, getting the projects off diesel? With respect to water, it's a limited resource. Mining operations are conducted in places of the world where water may be a scarce resource. Is this an opportunity to think through how to develop a water management plan, which might actually fast track a permit that's a critical component to operations locally? On the S, a lot of mining operations are conducted in jurisdictions of the world that may not have the same sort of standards with respect to human rights, certain freedoms. How is this an opportunity to start keeping track of ways the company might focus on those issues as a litigation mitigation strategy to avoid future claims and class actions? On the G, people are familiar with the acronym CSR. That's been around, and corporate governance generally, to the point where it's been around for a long time, the importance of good corporate governance, board structure, diversity. Think in terms of the skill sets of the directors that are appointed to the boards. Have you got people who speak the local language? Have you got people appointed in the right places in your organization that understand how things are properly done at the local level? Someone who can explain it's standard for this sort of payment to be made with respect to keeping a mining claim in good standing, but that one there that's being requested, that one's offside in some way, and being able to articulate and flag those issues. Next slide, please. In terms of some pitfalls, let's talk about these. It's good practice to identify your audience and the purpose for disclosure, distinguishing between what's a best practice versus what's a legal requirement. And I would encourage a collaborative approach to identifying which ESG criteria relate to your operations, but also what type of pitfalls you might want to keep an eye on to try and avoid. And to do that, liaising with the people that you've got on the ground at the operational level, alongside your legal team, your lawyers, and your auditors. Next slide. People are very aware of the increased focus from a key audience, a key stakeholder group. It's the investors. And Kai will be speaking to this topic, but just to cover it quickly, institutional investors are focusing on ESG-related issues as a driver for long-term value. So in terms of making sure you're maintaining access to capital, reducing the cost of capital, and attracting new sources of capital, the commentary here is important to keep in mind. And not just identifying this as a critical audience, but the purpose of your disclosure. When you are communicating to this audience, what purpose, keep that in mind, are you trying to use your disclosure for? For example, are you trying to satisfy the requirements that need to be met in order to qualify the company to be included in a sustainability fund? An analyst somewhere is going to be ticking a bunch of boxes on a checklist to assess whether the company has included some of these things in their disclosure documentation. If that's your purpose, your disclosure piece looks different. Or are you trying to attract sustainability finance dollars? RBC, for example, has committed $100 billion in sustainability finance by 2025. If you're trying to attract some of those sustainable dollars, your disclosure might highlight the ways in which you are satisfying the green bond principles. Next slide. The next audience comes up here. It's the pitfall. Recognize the difference between what is legally required versus a best practice. And in terms of the Canadian regulators, they have been encouraging an approach since 2010 in terms of recognizing climate change related risks as being potentially material, a material risk that could affect the business, and necessitating the need to disclose those if they are in fact material, and actually disclosing the financial impacts of those risks on the operations. Next slide. This slide is intended to showcase ways in which you can be using a collaborative approach to identify overlap in all of these requirements, identifying the contradictions, and working your way through conflicting priorities. And it comes out with reference to some examples. So with reference to autonomous mining vehicles, a lot of mining companies lately are undertaking innovative approaches and encouraging the introduction of new technology into their operations. And if you think about what those big haul trucks do, it ticks a lot of really good ESG boxes. It gets your people out of the mine pit. It promotes health and safety. It allows the integration of technology that's not run on diesel. It increases the efficiency of the operations. But on the flip side, it results in displacement of a large amount of workers. And the next thing I would encourage, careful consideration, do not overcommit in your disclosure documentation. There is a big difference between telling people that you have complied with standards which require free, informed prior consent versus just consulting with stakeholder groups. And you want to make sure that you've not included reps or you've not included things in your documents committing you to things that you didn't need to do. Paying attention to the defined terms in these materials is very important. The definition of affected community comes up a lot. And I think the industry is used to considering Indigenous communities, Indigenous peoples as being part of that affected community. When you work your way through the material, I would query, are artisanal miners included in that definition as well? So when you are committing to stakeholder engagement, consent, consultation with an affected community, have you captured the artisanal miners? Should they be carved out? And last, deference to local laws. In the materials, there's a deference to what is locally required. So comply with the local laws. Next slide. If there is an absence of local law, it leaves a gap. And I think some of the larger companies have struggled with this reality. If there are governments in certain jurisdictions that all of a sudden are increasing taxes that are payable, increasing your royalties, there's a challenge there in terms of navigating the way in which you handle that. And my last slide, what I have here are just, it's a list of what constitutes good ESG disclosure. My suggestions would be comply with the legal requirements, draft it to achieve a purpose, and use an appropriate format. And what I've done there is I've provided an indication of the type of documents that can be used for this purpose. And these are all things that your legal team would be happy to help you work through and prepare. Thank you.
Great, Janet. Thanks very much. And some very good examples of ESG factors applied to on-the-ground operations, which I think the audience will find very interesting. So we're going to now climb onto Larry Finks' climate change wave, which of course is not only his, but it is waving across the industry generally. And Lisa DeMarco, our next speaker, is going to speak on carbon neutrality, stakeholder expectations, and performance indicators in the environmental space. Lisa is a senior partner of DeMarco Allan. DeMarco Allan is a boutique climate change, energy, and indigenous law firm working in association with Fasken. She's recognized by Chambers Global and by Lexpert as a leading climate change lawyer. And Lisa, we look forward to hearing your comments on carbon neutrality and some of the issues facing the mining industry.
Thank you so much, Tanneke. I appreciate that. And the intent is to provide you the perspective from reporting issuers, from critical investors, and from regulators in what they're looking for in associated climate-related financial disclosures. Very specifically, a chunk of the work we do is assisting investors and regulators in identifying key elements, going as far as using artificial intelligence to identify key elements of disclosure statements, to provide a good sense of what good corporate citizens, particularly in extractive sectors, are doing. So with that, let's get into it. Next slide. Carbon neutrality. It's a big word, and it can mean many different things to many different people. A number of entities have gotten into some challenges in around their claims around carbon neutrality. And I thought I'd just highlight what different entities in the sector and different entities that are leading climate-related disclosures are saying. So Rio Tinto recently set an ambition to reach net zero emissions by 2050 with discrete 2030 targets, and to reduce their emissions intensity by 30% and their absolute emissions by 15%. So what does that mean? Can you just offset down to meet that commitment? Can you just actually purchase carbon credits to meet that commitment? Well, no, there's an actual absolute emissions reduction in that criteria, but you can certainly see the increased focus on this issue as investors are questioning any number of mining companies about their specific commitments. Another one, Anglo American, what are they doing? They've committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by 2030, and they set a target of achieving carbon neutrality across their operations, both their direct emissions and their power and energy related emissions, otherwise known as Scope 1 and Scope 2, before 2040. Similarly, BHP set a target of net zero emissions by 2050. Why is the number 2050 coming up so much, you might ask? That's the key number coming out of the Paris Agreement on climate change. Unbeknownst to many of you, I was the public sector representative on the floor of the plenary when the Paris Agreement was being negotiated, acting on behalf of business and industry when we were coming to the development of those targets. 194 countries agreed to the target of affecting net zero emissions by 2050. So the pressure's on by both institutional investors, stakeholders, and other affected entities to really meet those targets. You see Teck similarly has set a goal of carbon neutrality. Maple Leaf Foods has pledged to reduce its absolute emissions by 30% and Scope 3 emissions by 30% by 2030. Microsoft has set a 2030 carbon negative goal. That means its net emissions are actually less than its actual emissions. So they do that by engaging in activities inside their supply chain and by purchasing offsets to get below their actual emissions level in any current year now. Unilever is widely viewed as leading the pack of multinationals. Just as early as last week, they set a very aggressive commitment to reach into their supply chain and start reducing emissions throughout their supply chain, as well as addressing their own carbon neutrality within a defined goal. Very significant dollar amounts addressed to that, and they found that in effect, it's good business. Similarly, Shell and BP have made related carbon neutrality commitments, and Mars Company is also set to reduce its target emissions by a very significant percent. Again, all around that 2050 goal. So how do they do that? Let's go to the next slide. First of all, they look at what their stakeholder expectations are. And as Janet and Francois indicated, they look to the increasing number of standards, but also are pulling from what their investors and critical stakeholders are demanding. Particularly at this point, climate-related disclosures are seen as mainstream. We've seen Larry Fink's letter, we've seen Amazon's actions this week, we've seen a recent opinion for the climate change legal initiative issued last Friday, indicating that the board of directors must be addressing this to be diligent. So very significant part of the duty of care, as well as the fiduciary duty. Also, we're seeing capital starting to be discretionary as to where it wants funds to go. And the investor preferences are demanding demonstration of appropriate attention to not just near-term climate issues, but the longer-term climate transition. And that really includes three aspects: the physical risks of climate change, the legal and liability risks of climate change, and also the transition risks of climate change. I've said risk several times though, and much like Janet was indicating, in a number of extractive industries, there is also climate opportunity. And from this perspective, good, open, transparent, and well thought out climate governance, toned from the top, as well as climate disclosures, can provide a strategic advantage. And that's a point I don't want to go unheard in this. So looking at bank lenders, there's a host of new financial opportunities. The green bond criteria are very significant and allow for access to very significant amounts of capital. One cross-border entity went out for a small green bond ask of 300 million and got 1.5 billion in committed capital. There is definitely sustainability capital out there that is looking for a home. Also, it's indicative of good financial performance. We're seeing correlations of strong corporate management with strong climate-related disclosures. And then new investors are certainly demanding this. As I said, we're working on a lot of artificial intelligence to facilitate access, to pick out very quickly, is this greenwash or are they really doing something? So next slide. Just to emphasize and drill down on the point, Mercer has actually done an annual chart analysis looking at what is going to happen to certain classes of assets as a function of climate change if we look at meeting the 2-degree scenario set out in the Paris Agreement, and if we look at achieving that in a 2030 timeline, where are we going to be, and then also specific to the 2050 timeline. And very specifically, you can see that the oil and gas sector is going to face some challenges, and this is consistent with their past performance. Renewables are actually going to see significant opportunity. Electric utilities, as they're currently constructed, the status quo is going to be challenging, but there's opportunity for change. Developed market equities, which many of you operate in and around. It's not a bad story. There are some significant opportunities for growth to facilitate a sustainable economy. Similarly, infrastructure, which may include mining related infrastructure, has some very, very significant opportunities if that infrastructure is prepared sustainably with choice of materials, with optionality, with measurement and monitoring that is effectively consistent with the guidelines we're seeing. We do see most conforming to the TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, that criteria that was led by Mark Carney and former Mayor Bloomberg. And we're seeing a lot of the general principles in that getting incorporated and rolled into the World Economic Forum discussion draft. So more to come there. But the point is, good climate-related disclosure is not a task. It is an opportunity. I'll pass back to you, Tanneke.
Great, thanks very much, Lisa. Nice to hear an optimistic note and talk of opportunities as opposed to risks, as an awful lot of the ESG material is focusing on risks. I'd like to pass it over to my partner, Kai Alderson, who's going to talk a little bit more on this access to capital point and the issues and the possible opportunities of new sources of capital linked to ESG performance. Kai, Kai, I was about to introduce you.
Sorry about that. I jumped the gun. Back to you.
I know you're really keen on this topic, but Kai is a partner in our Vancouver office in the Energy and Natural Resources Group. And in addition to being very keen to speak and advising on ESG matters, Kai advises mining clients on Indigenous and environmental law matters. And Kai, now please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Tanneke, and thanks for all of you attending. I wanted to give a bit of a personal, additional biographical note before turning to the content of my talk, which is that about 20 years ago, before I even went to law school and became a lawyer, I was actively involved in the ESG sector. So this is basically my entire professional career has been spent in and around ESG. At that time, ESG was a niche product. And what's interesting is to see it emerge basically unchanged. It's basically the same set of issues, the same set of concerns, and it has moved from the niche to the mainstream, and that's really exciting. So if we could have the first slide in the presentation, just thought it would be good to start by talking about the range of ESG approaches that are out there, because that really shapes the access to capital discussion. ESG runs all the way from negative screening, excluding individual stocks or bonds, to the concept of integrating ESG analysis into risk assessments, right over to where you're actively promoting highly sustainable or beneficial technologies or industries through impact investing or other funds which target investments. Next slide, please. That shapes the access to capital discussion, because when I was involved in the ESG industry, and I think the same is true now, we always used to think that companies were basically fell on something like a normal curve in any particular issue area. And the function of ESG, at least the negative screening, was to exclude the companies that were dramatic underperformers. And then at the high end, we were trying to invest in or celebrate or highlight companies that were outperforming. But also we were engaging with the vast majority of companies in the middle and encouraging them to adopt policies and disclosure to move the median company up the curve, so to speak. And that really does remain functionally the focus of ESG today. And so when we're talking about access to capital, I think the main thing to remember for all of you is that we're not just talking about divestment campaigns. We're not just talking about negative access. We're actually also talking about positive access and this kind of engagement, conditional access that will hit the vast majority of companies. Next slide, please. To start with the negative access, there's a long tradition, obviously, of divestment campaigns in ESG, amongst ESG investors. And it's useful just to bring that to mind as we think about what's happening today. So the big divestment campaign that sort of kicked everything off really related to South Africa and anti-apartheid movements. And I don't want to dwell on that, but just to highlight the key features of that divestment campaign as a process. It started with religious groups, spread to universities, and grew into public pensions, engaging in divestment, and then encouraging, not only divesting directly, but encouraging other banks, insurance companies, and other parties to themselves divest, and also had a global norm that had emerged in the international political sphere And we see all of those same issues, or same elements, I should say, in what is the current, probably most prominent divestment or negative access campaign around coal and other fossil fuels. So the numbers that are on the screen are from the campaigners, from fossil-free divestment. And so I take these numbers with a grain of salt, but it certainly does conform in my mind to those key elements of a divestment campaign. You'll see faith-based organizations taking the lead, as well as educational institutions, but moving into public funds. The UK University Pension Fund for the universities in the UK recently announced they were divesting from coal. You have other pension plans starting to pressure insurers and other financial intermediaries to divest from coal. And so this is something that I think will continue. I don't see much other topic or subject matter that really has all of those elements of a sustainable divestment campaign. And so I expect that although coal and then other fossil fuels will continue for some time, I'm not seeing a lot that would suggest that there would be other divestment campaigns. If we could move on to the next slide, please. The other end of the spectrum is the positive access. The green and social bonds have already been mentioned, and you see the dramatic rise in US $1 billion up to over $300 billion last year. Those include both green targeted investments as well as bonds that are focused on social ends. We're seeing a big uptick this year during COVID-19 responses to focus on those social bonds or COVID bonds. And so 2020 is off to a good start already, and I expect that this curve will continue. And next year we'll have seen an outperformance over last year in that graph. The other area that's already been mentioned in terms of companies like Microsoft, Google, and Amazon and Unilever are companies in setting aside some of their cash into funds that will invest in new technologies or transitional technologies. And we are also seeing insurers launching bond funds that will target climate risk in their portfolio allocation. And so at the positive end, we're also seeing these kind of impact funds driving dollars towards sustainable outcomes, or at least performance metrics that are adopted by these companies. And we're seeing certainly in the hydrocarbon space, a clear difference in access to capital in terms of spreads of interest rates that renewables, as opposed to traditional hydrocarbons or coal, can attract. And so we are seeing that difference already, and we expect to see things emerging, impact funds emerging in the mining sector, perhaps targeting outperforming companies within a particular subsector. And so that is probably something that we'll see. Next slide, please. So in the conditional access, this is the sort of engagement and with project finance or with proponents who are seeking dollars for their core operations. The Equator Principles have been around for 10 years now, but are seeing a new round, the Equator Principles 4. Implementation has been deferred from July until October because of COVID. But we've seen not only the massive growth of the Equator Principle financial institutions, more and more companies applying this. Anecdotally, I am hearing that they're more and more being used in the course of credit making decisions. So they're having more bite, and they're increasing in scope. So in the Equator Principles 4, we're going to see more attention to biodiversity, more attention to FPIC, which has already been mentioned, and more clarity around climate change. Finally, we're seeing sustainability-linked lending, where credit decisions will be made and loans will be made, where there will be advantages to achieving particular targets or KPIs. That's a new area, rapidly emerging, and again, an important area in this access to capital conversation. Next slide, please. So we started out talking about this normal curve, companies distributed between underperformers and outperformers, with the vast bulk of companies in the middle. But that's also true of investors, and that's also true of the access to capital conversation, that the folks who are focusing on divestment and the folks who are investing in impact funds are actually a smaller number. The vast majority of investors or ESG investment dollars are focused on this middle range, this engagement approach, encouraging companies to address issues. And so if we could have the next slide, please, just to close out, my recommendation to clients is to sort of let that divestment conversation fade into the background. It's what's in the news. Focus instead on strategy. Use ESG disclosures to identify areas where there's an overlap between financial objectives and ESG objectives, and then just focus on growing that area in the center where those two bubbles overlap. It's not easy. I know that it's hard, but it's no harder than any of the other impossible things that mining companies are required to do to run their businesses, and it is achievable. And with that, I will pass the baton back to Tanneke.
Great, thanks very much, Kai. And I think interesting comment you made at the beginning of your presentation, that some of these underlying ESG factors have been around in the mining industry for a long time, and mining and energy companies have had to deal with them for a long time. Some of them, and some of these on-the-ground operations obviously give rise to a significant amount of risk. And Cliff Sosnow from our Ottawa office is going to talk to us about what happens when some of those risks materialize into causes of action. Clifford Sosnow is a co-chair of the firm's International Trade and Customs Law Group. And as I mentioned, he is from our Ottawa office, and within the Global Mining Group, he specializes in anti-bribery and sanctions work. He's our go-to person for that. And he's going to lead us through a discussion of what may happen when you get to the courtroom. Cliff, over to you.
Great, thanks, Tanneke, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for participating with us, and look forward to your questions. I'm going to be speaking about a particular decision called NEFSUN, a recent decision by the Supreme Court of Canada, not the anti-bribery and corruption space. That's my usual bailiwick. This one deals with human rights, alleged violations of labor rights that has taken place outside of Canada, but that is now before Canadian courts. I should say, full disclosure, we do represent NEFSUN, and so the views that I'm going to be providing are my own views, not of our client. So it will be a high-level discussion, but I think for purposes of this conversation, that high-level discussion is what's important. Next slide, please. So why is this case even before the Supreme Court of Canada, or why did the case get before the Supreme Court of Canada? Well, NEFSUN entered into a transaction, an ownership transaction, with the Eritrean National Mining Corporation. It's a company owned by the Eritrean government to set up what's called the Bisho Mine Share Company. And the percentages are noted up above to operate the Bisho Mine, which is one of the largest sources of revenue for the Eritrean state. And as a matter of fact, the court has found that NEFSUN, with the 60% ownership, did have effective and operational control over Bisho. I should say that, unlike that particular slide that is up there, there was not a direct ownership of NEFSUN with the Bisho Share Company. There was, in fact, a chain of subsidiaries between NEFSUN, the chain of subsidiaries, and then the Bisho Mine Share Company. In 2008, Heersche Mine Company hired a South African engineering company called Senet, S-E-N-E-T, who in turn subcontracted the operation of the mine to two Eritrean companies called Merab, which is controlled by the Eritrean military, and Segen, which was owned by Eritrea's only political party. In both Merab and Segen allegedly used conscripts from Eritrea's National Service Program to operate the mines. Allegations by workers are that the mines were harsh, that there were dangerous conditions, that people were physically abused, that they were not allowed to leave their camps. They were forced to stay there. If they left, they were severely punished or their families faced retribution. 3 of those workers found their way to Canada and initiated proceedings in British Columbia against Nevsun. And uniquely, they alleged damages for breaches of what is called customary international law. And some of you are familiar with it. I suspect most of you are not. And we're going to talk a little bit about what customary international law is very shortly. And the customary international law norms they alleged were violated were slavery, forced labor, cruel and inhuman punishment. And that issue is still before the courts. The question, though, before the courts that gave rise to the Supreme Court decision is whether or not there was a reasonable chance that this kind of claim could result in a successful lawsuit against Nevsun. Nevsun claimed that it did not and asked for the claim to be rejected. The British Columbia Supreme Court in Chambers said, no, we're going to let it go through. The Court of Appeal also agreed and said, no, we're going to let it go through. And the case went before the Supreme Court of Canada. So the next slide, please. And the issue before the Supreme Court of Canada is what you see up on that slide. And if you want to take 5 seconds to read it. The issue, basically, the Supreme Court is saying is, okay, we're going to examine whether violations of customary international law can result in a claim for damages that's enforceable in Canadian courts. And if the answer is yes, the case proceeds. If the answer is no, the case is struck out. Next slide. So what is customary international law? And it's something that I'm hoping that all of you will be familiar with because, again, this is forming the basis of a risk discussion. This is not an opportunity, although risks always provide opportunities. Well, customary international law was defined by the Supreme Court as a kind of common law of international law. And for those of you that are not lawyers, common law is basically judge-made law where individual judges make decisions, other judges notice those decisions, agree with those decisions, and over time a critical mass is formed where everybody agrees this is a no-brainer and this makes perfectly good sense, and we will always apply this law in these particular facts and circumstances. Well, substitute judge-made law for state practice. And individual states followed by other states over decades, perhaps centuries, believe in a certain practice, and that practice is assumed to have a legal obligation. This in itself is not a new concept, it's a normal concept. An example of customary international law is ships out in the high seas have a legal obligation to save those ships that are in distress. Next slide, please. What makes this case different and in fact unique in the legal world is that the Supreme Court in a split decision, and we can talk about the dissent shortly, but given the time, let's just talk about what the majority held, said that customary international law is no different than any other form of Canadian law. It's basically by the principle of the doctrine of adoption brought into Canadian law, and it's no different than tax law, it's no different than labor law, it's no different than contract law. And there we have a big difference between the Supreme Court majority and the Supreme Court dissent, because the Supreme Court majority went on to say that unless Parliament says that this particular customary international law violates existing Canadian legislation and therefore is not acceptable, or if this customary international law is a new norm, one that is not already established, one that's not already accepted, and that therefore may have to be proven, it becomes automatically a ground for liability claims. And the key point here is that that liability claim is not just against states. That's very 20th century thinking, that customary international law, according to the majority, can now frame a claim in damages against corporations, against you, against me, against any company. And this is according to the Supreme Court decision in Canada. I should say there's no other decision anywhere in the world that has taken this particular view. And then the court went on to say, as with any other common law kind of situation, where judges will fashion remedies to fit the particular claims to damages, the Supreme Court said, well, courts in Canada can do the exact same thing. Now, where the dissent deviated from this decision is they said, well, wait a second. We accept that customary international law can be brought in and made a basis of an obligation, but that obligation stops at the state. It doesn't filter down to corporations, and it certainly doesn't filter down to claims to damages. And the reason for that is, the dissent said, we're not aware of any customary law principle that requires a state to allow courts to fashion remedies where somebody is alleging violation of a customary international law principle. So we have the dissent, but frankly, in a very strong case, said, you know, you've really pushed this needle very, very far. And we have the majority that said, we think that there's no reason why customary international law principles should not apply to individual companies. So next slide. And this is the final slide. So where does this leave us? Well, corporate behaviors clearly are subject to, according to the majority decision, claims for violations of customary international law. I will say that suffused throughout the decision, the court made a distinction between core principles of international law and those that are new norms. Now, the core principles of customary international law are those that are on that slide. Prohibitions on slavery, forced labor, crimes against humanity. There's a few others. What the court said is, we're not entirely sure what to do about new claims. The majority said, well, we can take notice of them, but we recognize that maybe you may have to provide evidence of the dissent said that's a real confusing form of guidance. And so it's not entirely clear what is outside this core. I will say that if it is outside the core, you probably will have to provide evidence. But if it falls within that core, it automatically can be noticed by judges. No evidence is required. So what is the headline in closing on this? And obviously we can deal with it more in questions. There is a spotlight now created by the NEFSUN decision that applies to companies wherever they're operating. In other words, completely outside of Canada, separate from parliamentary law, a separate type of law that watches over corporate behavior, and that can form the basis of litigation liability in Canada, initiated by parties that feel aggrieved by corporate actions abroad, who seek to claim violations and remedies for those violations. And thank you for your attention. Over to you, Tanneke.
Wow, Cliff, thanks very much. That is certainly food for thought when it comes to managing your on-the-ground operations. Thank you to you and all the panelists for the excellent presentations and the wide variety of issues that have been covered. Certainly the questions that we've had come in are equally wide in their scope. So we'll try and tackle some of them while we have remaining time. I think, Cliff, given where we've just left off, perhaps we start with one for you while your presentation is still fresh in our mind. And that's whether or not the Nevsun decision creates a U.S. alien tort-like statute or a regime like that here in Canada. I know that's been a concern and a question of many off the back of the decision, but would appreciate your comment on that.
Well, the short answer is that the majority didn't deal with that issue. The dissent alleged that it does. For those of you that are not aware, the Alien Tort regime is based on what's known as the Alien Tort Statute. It's actually called the Alien Torts Claim Act. It's a U.S. piece of legislation. It's a very old piece of legislation dating back from 1789. And its scope right now is uncertain, but at this stage of the game, what it appears to do is to allow individuals aggrieved or alleged to be aggrieved by corporations with respect to acts done in other jurisdictions to bring their claims in the United States on the allegation that those that have acted to violate particular norms of international law should be held to account in U.S. courts, provided there's a connection between the corporation acting abroad and the United States. So, for example, somebody, a U.S. company in Guatemala, can be subject under the Alien Torts Statutes regime to a claim that they have violated international standards as it applies to human rights by a Guatemalan who feels aggrieved by it in U.S. courts. I should say whether or not corporations are subject to that liability is subject to dispute amongst courts. There's a certain amount of warring discussion between courts on that. And now transplant that into Canada, you can see some similarities. What the majority is saying is courts are liable, companies rather are liable for actions taken by them abroad in relation to parties that feel aggrieved by their actions where those parties allege a violation of international standards. In some ways, it goes past the Alien Tort regime in the sense that in the US, there is this legislation that forms the basis of court discussion and analysis. In Canada, there is no such legislation, and the dissent, in fact, said, well, you courts have taken the role of Parliament. You've, in effect, created a piece of legislation that doesn't exist, and you've now created a regime where, in fact, you've created liability or risk for corporations as a matter of judge-made decision without Parliament speaking to that issue. That's something for Parliament, not for you. So in some ways, Tanneke, it's similar to the Alien Tort Statute system. In some ways, it's way past the Alien Tort Statute system.
Great, thanks, Cliff. I think that definitely that will be space to watch. I'm going to switch over now some of the questions. We've had a question on some of the life of mine, beyond life of mine reporting standards. This is a question that came in. What are the best practices for reporting beyond life of mine? And can there be some assurances to stakeholders of sustainable resources today and sustainable resources tomorrow? I'm wondering, Janet, if perhaps you could provide some thought on that comment/question.
For sure. Thank you very much for that question. I think it's a very good one. I think this is something that a lot of companies will be faced with. So just to clarify, I think what the person is getting at here who was asked this question, it's an acknowledgement that there are certain assurances that need to be provided in order to potentially secure the consent of some of the stakeholders. And those assurances are extending beyond the point in time at which you're no longer mining, productions have closed, the life of mine has expired. It's into the closure phase of production. And thinking like a lawyer, what we would want to do is acknowledge the importance of making sure those commitments have been made, but at the same time protecting the company from anything that might be an unidentifiable risk or contingent liability that's not foreseen. So with that framework in mind, best practices would consider things like community trust potentially. So if there's a bond that's posted, a reserve that's taken, what can you do so that if there are potential claims or there are potential issues that come up, how have you responsibly transitioned accountability, responsibility for the management of those issues somewhere else? A community trust, for example, a trustee can be appointed. I think there's a point too to share on this question. When you're talking about sustainable resources today and sustainable resources tomorrow, things are changing so quickly. It's not always clear to see what might be around the corner in tomorrow's day in terms of energy integration, management, the state of the law in some of these jurisdictions. Right now is in flux, as Cliff is alluding to. Thinking that through carefully would be important. And the last thing I would flag, just from a contracting perspective in the M&A space, you see as part of the negotiations that happen dealing with third-party beneficiary claims. So if you are a large company and you've done a really great job putting your community trust in place, and now you are undertaking an effort to sell an asset, you need to make sure that those community trusts are maintained but passed along and inherited by the next owner. So clarifying in the documentation that you are not going to be responsible for any third-party beneficiary claims in that way is something else that would be a best practice that comes to mind just on the fly and thinking through some of the issues. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Janet. I think some interesting comments there, including sort of the broader sort of context comment, which leads me to a question actually we've received from Ted Gershner. And this is, I think, Kai will direct this to you. He's asking, we're seeing institutions pull investments from industries on a sectoral basis. Would a strong ESG strategy make a difference? Or will sectors continue to be painted with one brush? I think this is quite a relevant question, because I think we all know that from a sectoral and industry perspective, the mining industry does have its work cut out for it in improving its image. So Kai, happy to hear from you on this one.
Thanks, and thanks, Ted. That actually is a really good question. I tend to think that there's a bit of a gap between what activists and the social movements may be advocating for and the actual screens that companies are putting in place. So even if we take the divest from fossil fuels example that I talked about during my presentation, the number that I threw up on the screen was what the groups claim, which is 14.4 trillion or something like that, screens out fossil fuels. But if you look at that, there's actually a wide range of nuance there between company that captures funds that are screening out coal, funds that are screening out particular subsectors of the fossil fuel industry and promoting natural gas as a fossil fuel. So it's a really wide range. There's a lot of nuance. I think it's a natural fear that as companies start talking about their performance, putting their head above the parapet, so to speak, then they're going to start taking incoming fire. But it really doesn't need to work like that. I think it's very, very important for companies to tell your story, tell it candidly, be careful, obviously, but speak about what you are doing. And then, as I said in my presentation, you just kind of let the other stuff fall into the background, because even where it looks like ESG screens are taking things on a sectoral basis, quite often there's a lot more variety in how those screens are actually applied. So it's more important to deal with ESG issues as a strategic corporate concern and less worry about your sector being screened out entirely.
Thanks, Kai. I'm just thinking through your response there and going from the sectoral to the specific corporate strategy, and then perhaps down to what specific companies may be doing in a region. And in the energy space, we've had a question come in about getting off the grid and how would getting off the grid, whether it's renewables or otherwise, help you in a region with a clean electricity system. And I'm wondering, Lisa, if you could take a stab at comment on that question/comment, also in the context of Kai's approach to focusing on applications of your business in the region in which you're operating.
Sure, certainly in relation to the mining sector getting off grid, often it's not an all or nothing proposition, but it's developing behind the meter resources that are often zero emission. So it has multiple benefits. You actually reduce your corporate wide emissions and can report that reduction in scope 2 emissions. And then secondly, it provides an additional reliability mechanism that just supports continuity of the business and operations in the event that there's a fluctuation in the grid. People often say in a jurisdiction like Ontario, which is notionally 94% emission free, why bother developing independent renewables when our grid is so clean? Well, if we just relied on our grid for electricity, there would be at least somewhat of an argument that the grid itself is providing that. But along the transmission corridor, there are line losses. So there are emissions associated with that. And then there are imports and exports that actually contribute quite a bit to our emissions. So for example, Ontario's emission intensity is about 36 kilograms per megawatt hour of CO2 equivalent. Our neighbors to the south, if we're importing from Michigan, have an emissions intensity of 738 kilograms per megawatt hour. So well more than an order of magnitude higher in emissions. So anytime we're on peak and we're relying on imports, you're actually seeing an associated increase in emissions. So lots of practical business issues for cost savings, number one, reliability, number two, and greenhouse gas emissions reductions that might contribute to good environmental and social governance, wise associated leadership, and smart financial performance resulting from the implementation of renewable behind the fence. I hope that helps.
I think it certainly does. And I'd like to take sort of the Ontario specific and then the company specific question. I'd like to kick it back open to a broader discussion about some of the social expectations that we see arising, not only as a result of the pandemic that we're seeing, but also as a result of various corruption and other allegations in the commodity trading space. It's been a turbulent time for many. And Francois, I'm wondering if you could give some comment on whether or not there are ways to adjust to a new political environment after or post-pandemic, driven by sort of heightened scrutiny and changes in public policy that might be driven by increased activism. And yeah, just a comment about social expectations post-COVID.
Thank you, Tanneke. I think the world as we have known it pre-COVID is going to change immensely. The poor is getting poorer every day, especially because of COVID. In South Africa, it's not an exception. We've seen over the last 3 months that more and more businesses are closed down. So there's a bigger responsibility on companies to look at their social footprint, and especially their footprint within communities where they operate. And there's certainly an expectation that mining companies within the labor sending areas do a lot more than just social and labor plan activities, that they carefully look at their footprint and how they can uplift the community as a whole. So, you know, in South African context, socioeconomic upliftment is a real factor that is already considered. But I do think that COVID and the impact of COVID on small and medium-sized businesses is far worse than the previous experiences that we had. So in my view, companies will have to look at especially their footprint in communities where they had, for instance, a bigger circle of influence than just the employees at the mine. You know, the supporters and the larger group of people involved in a mining operation is no longer just a good to have. You have to specifically delve down and see how suppliers and supply chains are going to be impacted by COVID and adjust your social criteria according to that.
Thanks, Francois. Kai, I was wondering if you had any comments on sort of the heightened scrutiny and changes in public policy that you might be seeing, given also your previous experience, or the fact that you've been working in this space for some time and have no doubt seen some changes along the way.
Well, I think it is. I think it's true that there's a strong interaction between the public policy and the ESG forces or decisions that our investors are making. And I think it actually goes both ways. So sometimes, and I think this is probably true with the divestment campaigns around fossil fuels, sometimes it's the absence of public policy which exacerbates the issue and raises pressure and increases the demands from ESG investors from looking for disclosure and improved performance to actually advocating for divestment. So I think that's one area as an example where it is probably going to take more public policy stability, if I can put it that way, in order to let the air out of some of the divestment campaigns. So that's again something for companies to think about when they are dealing with a particular divestment campaign or concerns about divestment campaigns, is what can be done to engage influencers and opinion leaders around particular areas such that there's sufficiently robust public policy that investors don't feel they have to take matters into their own hands and pursue actually these very negative and highly disruptive divestment campaigns. So that's one thought or contribution there.
Yeah, it's thanks, Kai. It strikes me that certainly within the ESG context, the environment and climate change has been the prevalent sort of public policy driven area that has led to some regulatory requirements. And I'm wondering, Lisa, if you could, perhaps we have a few minutes, just comment on some of those regulatory requirements and climate related disclosures that have arisen in the environmental space.
Yeah, there have been a number, and in the Canadian context, we see some of them codified in more or less best practices in the Canadian Securities Administrators Guidance in 51333 and then 51358. But the key document right now is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And it really looks to strategy management, risk, and scenario planning as key elements. And the scenario planning around transition risk has been very problematic and difficult for companies to assess in their own context. So you'll see a lot of entities, Mercer and Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan and others engaged in scenario planning activity and financial analysis around a 1.5 degree scenario and a 2 degree scenario. And really the gist of what's going on and best practice in these disclosures and meeting those ongoing nearly regulatory requirements, not quite exactly regulatory requirements, but nearly regulatory requirements, is the question of, are you being diligent? Are you assessing what are known foreseeable risks of extreme weather events? And how are you incorporating them into what a reasonable investor would need to know to invest in your company? So those elements are very, very important. In the domestic regulatory context, we have legislation. So there's the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act federally, and a number of equivalent provincial pieces of legislation that are operating under it. Specifically Alberta, part of Saskatchewan have been deemed equivalent, BC, any number, Quebec have been deemed equivalent. So there are regulatory regimes that look at mandating some sort of pricing around greenhouse gas emissions and implementing a reporting scheme and following up with the compliance obligation on an annual basis. And so looking at how entities are doing under those regimes, and in fact, some are doing quite well. Some have become the suppliers in those related markets where there's an output-related performance standard. And that's something to look at when you're looking at distinguishing, as someone asked, one part of a sector from another part of a sector. Certainly, there is ample opportunity from credible and intelligent and detailed and sophisticated investors to really parse out who's going to win in the climate game, who's going to do better in a sector than other entities because of their diligence. So those are some very high-level regulatory requirements, Tanneke, but we can go into the nitty-gritty. I'd be here all day.
Thanks, Lisa. I think if we went into the nitty-gritty of any number of issues that we've discussed in today's seminar, we would be here for months, actually, not just all day. So I know we're coming up to our allotted time. I would like to thank you all for joining us for this discussion. As Lisa mentioned, and I think as any of us would reiterate, we are always happy to chat and discuss some of these issues. It's clearly, notwithstanding the history, an evolving and continuing developing area with not only stakeholder expectations changing, but courtroom liabilities arising and regulatory requirements being developed. So I think there will be continued movement here. I'd like to thank personally each of our panelists for the presentations and the work in preparing same. I wish everybody a very happy Canada Day for those that are Canadians on Wednesday. And a brief reminder for our audience, picking up on the regulatory disclosure requirements and developments. We will be hosting a seminar on ESG and public disclosure issues, in which we will have members of the OSC present, and that will take place on July 15th. To continue the ESG discussion, which I think we all know has not stopped. So thanks again, and goodbye.